Yeah, one of those old.
It's got 128.
Okay, I'm on.
It's not urgent.
It's not really needed.
This is very different from a Zoom meeting. People are out here talking, and in a Zoom meeting, we just turn off their mics.
Good luck with this one.
And they have these grates on the floor that
Yeah, okay.
bring these
Thanks,
mats
Ed.
in the cover.
Welcome. This is our second in-person meeting, and it's really nice to be able to talk to people in a crowd. Although I just got back from NAB, that was a crowd. I want to welcome you here to RMU. This is the first time that we've had a meeting here, and this is a really great conference room that we have. Tim Jones, thank you very much. And Christine, for her help in pulling this together. And this has turned out to be a really great venue. We'd like to come back someday, even.
Better behave.
That's right, if we don't get kicked out. I'd like to thank the managers of the SMPTE section, and especially George Hoover, who stood in for me while I was away at NAB and got everything pulled together for the meeting. Although we have a relatively small turnout, we are recording this, and we'll post this to our website so that everybody can see this presentation, because I think it's a really important one. Finally, the next meeting is the NAB review meeting. Following that, we usually take July and August off, and so the next meeting will be in the fall. And we hope to have some good meetings. And Bill Bennett, manning the camera, will be the chair at that point, and I'm sure he'll come up with some great meetings in the fall. So tonight's presentation is by Glen Brusporski about DSLR, 3-chip, single-chip cameras, all different kinds of cameras that he's worked with for a very long time. Glen and I both lived in the Cocoa Beach, Florida area where NASA was. His parents, my parents all worked at the Cape. We both went to the same high school. We both went to the same college, University of Florida. So we've known each other for 40 years or so. So without further ado...
Plus I bought Sony stuff from you.
That's true, he did, yes. So without further ado, my friend and customer, I understand, Glen Brusporski.
I also want to thank Tim and Joe helped me get the equipment in the building here. So it's great that our Robert Morris helps us here and provided the food and everything. It's pretty much going above and beyond the call of duty. So anyway, my name's Glen Przyborski, and believe it or not, for the past 50 years, I have directed and photographed television commercials, and that's pretty much all I've done in that time. And anyway, what I thought I'd do is in that time period, I guess I've worked with every format, 35 millimeter, 16 tube type TV camera shooting, as well as DSLRs and what do you call them, the digital cinema cameras and all the other stuff today. And anyway, I'm calling the presentations DSLRs versus camcorders. And 3 important terms. CCD, stands for charge coupled device. I went through a listing of my little talk, and I thought I'm going to blur through these words, and if I don't explain what they are, people aren't going to know what they are. You guys that are techno guys will know exactly what they are. But I brought this for everyone to pass around. This is a broadcast charge coupled device, Ed, and you guys can check it out and pass it on. It's kind of unique because when you look at it carefully and you see that little tiny windowing area, it's hard to imagine that the lens forms an area in that little tiny space that's 8 millimeters or so wide, and that forms an image on your 65-inch TV. So it's quite the device. And I also brought one of these. This is the beam splitter prism. That's the part of almost every broadcast television camera, and it consists of 3 CCDs and a an optical prism that's made up by 3 pieces of optical glass and dichroic mirrors. And whenever you hear someone say a 2/3 inch color camera, that's what's inside. And it's a pretty amazing thing. It's also hard to believe that that prism was actually created way back in 1964, from what I can gather. It was invented by Philips over in Holland. And it's been the standard of the broadcast industry for all those years. And whenever you hear about a 2/3 inch camera, that's what they're talking about. Now, the CCDs have pretty much been replaced by CMOS devices, which is complementary metal oxide semiconductors. And so they both do the same thing. They both change your image from the lens into a signal that the camera is going to put out. But anyway, I thought if you hear those terms in it, those are what the terms mean. The last term is PL mount. And PL mount is important because it stands for positive lock. And this is a mount that was invented by Aeroflex back in 1984. And literally all motion picture cameras, with the exception of Panavision, use this mount to hold lenses on. It's extremely strong, and you guys can look at it, twist it, play around with it. It's called PL, and you'll see in all the ads for the modern cameras it'll say PL mount, or you can even get a PL mount adapter for your DSLR. And that's what they look like, and you can tell they're very, very strong as far as what they do. Now, I thought to appreciate today's cameras and what's available to you guys to rent, especially you young people, or to buy, we would go back and look at a little bit of history, and that history is from the decade between the years 2000 and the year 2010. And if it was 2000, if you think of the mindset of that, you wouldn't have a iPhone or anything. You would have this. You'd have a StarTAC, and the StarTAC was the most popular phone of its time. It came out in 1998, and if you had a signal problem, you would raise the antenna to get an extra bar or something. Yeah. But anyway, that's the time frame we're talking about, 2000. And at that same time, if you worked in movies, all motion pictures were being shot on 35mm film. There was no such thing as digital imaging or digital making of a movie on digital. And if you went to the theater with your girlfriend or boyfriend, you would be watching motion picture film literally playing on 2 different projectors as opposed to a digital cinema playback. And that's where things were. If episodic TV on prime time would almost all be shot on 35mm, and of course one transferred to tape and all on the air. But film was king back in the year 2000. Now, to just tell you about something about myself, we used to do all commercials in 35mm. Literally, we made our living in our business based on shooting movie film on TV commercials and then posting them on tape. So that's where we were in the year 2000. Now, in 2000, Sony announces a partnership with Panavision. And I think everyone's certainly heard of the word Panavision, but they're a company in California, and they're based out of California. They're worldwide. They make very high-end quality 35mm, 16mm, 70mm movie cameras. And Panavision was in the, obviously, movie camera business, and Sony is in the electronics business. So for Sony to get street cred for this new product they had coming out with, they thought, well, we'll just associate with Panavision. Because Panavision, no one says anything bad about Panavision. Panavision also has an interesting business model in that they never sell anything. So if you see Panavision, you can't buy anything from Panavision. If you walk in for the tour, and they do have tours out there, they'll sell you a hat or a t-shirt or something, but they won't sell you any cameras or any lenses. And that's their business model. Now, Sony introduced this camera here, the HDW F900. And that camera was the first 24p digital cinema camera to ever come out and hit the marketplace. And if you look at it, you're thinking to yourself, well, wait a minute, that looks like an ENG camera that Channel 11 or Channel 2 is using or something. But I think Sony actually took the frame of one of their high-end, normal high-def cameras and then reworked the entire interior of it. And that camera was part of their Cine Alta line, and Larry Thorpe, who's probably the smartest man to ever work in the world of television, it was his project basically. And when that camera came out, it literally shook the world of everything, because that product wasn't done to just make nice pictures. It was made to eliminate movie film. And whenever you do a change like that, it's a big deal. And I know movie companies, Aeroflex, all these companies around were suddenly going, wait a minute, what's happening here? Or, you know, and everyone was shocked at that. And the electronics companies were shocked too, because suddenly maybe they don't want to be left out in the street. You know, you don't want Sony to dominate the world with 24p or digital cinema stuff. So it was literally a game changer. And, you know, it's a corny words, but it really was at the time. And that product became very, very popular, very, very fast. And when Sony sold that, you can't see it, but on the other side there was actually a tape deck where you'd put an HD cam cassette in there. Well, if you owned that, you would also have to own the way to play back the tape. So if you left the shoot, you would suddenly have to buy one of their tape decks, and I believe at the time the one we bought was like $75,000. Could that have been something at that price level? So it was a very expensive proposition to buy that camera and a deck that would play back the 24-frame tape. And that camera, even though it has 2/3 inch, and that's one of the reasons we're passing this around, it has 2/3 inch CCDs. But for the first time, Sony put progressive scan CCDs in there instead of the normal interlaced CCDs. And progressive scanning on the CCD let it operate at, 24p, 25p for the people in Europe, that's their standard over there, or 2997. That was the fastest it would go. Or it could do conventional 1080i, but I don't think many people used it for that. And so that Prism that you guys passed around and put back, it looks like in one piece, that Prism was what was inside there, and the lens put its image on the 3 CCDs back then, and it made a great looking picture. Now, what I did here, we at first rented some of these and then we eventually bought one, but I wanted to show you what the images look like from the F900 with a standard Fujinon TV camera lens. Now this is a 30-second spot I directed and filmed with Jerome Bettis for S&T Bank. And anyway, here's the commercial. Hopefully the sound's on, but check out what this camera looked like.
Whoa! Oh, Mr. Bettis, is your house made of Visa cards?
Not just Visa, S&T Rewards Visa. It's the only card attached to the equity in my home.
Attached?
Whoa! That means I get lower interest rates and lots of rewards. Plus I get a tax benefit.
From the IRS? Whoa!
Oh yeah, ask your tax advisor. Hey, get your own.
S&T Bank Rewards Visa. Get your own.
Now, what was unusual about that spot, and what people started, not this spot, but using the F900, was it had a very wide depth of field. And that's basically because of those tiny imagers that you just had in your hand. And it's a relationship of the size of the imager or the sensor, people write sensor all the time now, and the lens. It's like a combination of the two causes what would be the depth of field if you're at the same focal length and the same iris setting. And so, anyway, that you were sort of stuck with everything kind of being in focus. So rather than having Jerome's face razor sharp in the background being a blur, you have a door behind him that you can see the detail on the door and stuff. And people that were true cinema people that were used to 35mm movie film and all didn't like that part of the F900. The rest of it seemed to work very well and was very well liked. Now, as I said here, the 2/3 inch camera, they lack depth, or it's technically, they lack the ability to do a tight depth of field. And that was associated with 35mm, and it wasn't with these 2/3 inch cameras. So you're thinking to yourself, well, you're stuck, you got that camera, right? So, well, believe it or not, there was a company that made depth of field adapters. And most people would have never heard of these things, maybe the older guys have. But the one that we gravitated to was made by a company in Portland, Oregon, called Letus 35, that's L-E-T-U-S 35. And they're still in business. I took this from their website. They still sell that same product. It turns out they've been making that product back in the days of standard definition. I mean, wasn't something new, but suddenly they introduced one that was made for high definition and had a better quality optics and all. And what this thing did, which was pretty amazing, is the front of it, you see where the blue ring is, that in that case was a Nikon lens mount for a Nikon F lens. In this case, it was the AIS or the A, if you're familiar with Nikon lenses, the AI or AIS lens. And you put any one of the Nikon lenses on there, and then the back of it had an adapter, which is not in that shot there, that had the B4 male mount. So your F900 thought that was a lens. So it snapped in just like it was a lens, and you locked your the breech mount on the TV camera. Now, the way that worked, which was pretty, this is almost like a Rube Goldberg thing. The Nikon lens photographs on a ground glass, and which is inside there. Now, if you guys are familiar with ground glass, it's a thin piece of optical glass that's frosted on one side, but absolutely clear on the other side. So, what happens is the lens, your Nikon lens focuses its image on the ground glass. Meanwhile, the TV camera looks through a relay lens and two mirrors and looks at that picture from the opposite side of the ground glass. And now, anyone that's familiar with things say, wait a minute, Glenn, wouldn't you see the grain? Wouldn't you see the crap that made up the ground glass? Well, you would, except that little thing spun the ground glass at 1,000 RPMs. So, and it had a motor inside there, and you could actually change the speed of it, ran on 12 volts. And when you shot with it, the ground glass disappeared, and you had the perfect depth of field that a 35 millimeter movie camera would have. And so it was pretty innovative at its time. And here, on this shot here, I used to direct and film all the AutoZone national spots for 4 years. And this is us on the set of an AutoZone commercial. And there's the F900 on the right. And you can see the lettuce adapter. You can see how big it is there next to the camera. And then that's a Nikon 35 millimeter f2 lens that's attached to it. And what you would do to get your best depth of field, you would open the iris on the Nikon lens full wide. And so it gave you the absolute minimum depth of field. And then you had another control on the side that went into the TV camera, so you could adjust the amount of light that it was feeding into the TV camera. So, you know, you had the kind of the best of both worlds in a way, except you had this very awkward thing on the front of your camera that weighed a whole lot. And we never bought one. I never bought one, but because by the way, they were $4,000 for that thing there. But what we did is we found a company that had them for rent, and they would rent that with 5 Nikon lenses, prime lenses, for $200 a day. So it didn't make any sense to buy it when you could do that. And AutoZone insisted back then that all their spots, even though the networks couldn't run them in HD yet, and they bought a lot of airtime on the SBN and a lot of different things, but they couldn't run HD TV spots yet. But they insisted that the whole library be done and shot in HD because they knew that was going to happen within a year or two, where they didn't want to have a small picture when maybe a competitor would have the full high def picture. So everything was shot in high def, and we must have done 4 or 5 complete campaigns with that adapter. And I thought, I went back to our library and I found one of these actual 30-second spots where all of this was shot with that adapter. And this is what it looked like, and you can see the very shallow depth of field that adapter allowed you to have.
Take matters in your own hands. Keep that car running better, longer. Do everything you can to make sure a small job doesn't turn into a costly one. And AutoZone is the one place with the expertise and tools you need to do the job right the first time. Because do it yourself doesn't mean you have to do it alone. Get in the zone. AutoZone.
When was that ad shot?
2000 and probably 2004. Something like that.
Well, it looks just like the ads are running today.
Yeah. Well,
It is the same ad.
they own the master, so they could run the same ad today. But anyway, that was an example of getting a depth of field out of a 2/3 inch camera when it had no ability to do that. And so, you know, that's what we did. Now, meanwhile, as I told you, we were talking about DSLRs. Well, 2001, Canon releases their first big DSLR. It's a big time one. It's the EOS 1D and has a 4 megapixel sensor. Okay. Your iPhone has a 12, so the 4 was good enough if they were sending a guy out for a newspaper, you know, where a newspaper resolution for that. But 1 year later, in 2002, they came out with the 1DS, which was 11 megapixels, and so it hopped that up to a usable thing. But back then, 0 video capability on the first camera or the second one. And as it turns out, in the early 2000s, up until, well, you'll see the actual first DSLR that could do video, but Canon, none of that equipment, none of the imagers, nor the electronics inside, or the memory, the CF memory cards, could run fast enough to do high definition video. I mean, none of that stuff ran fast enough. And then I talked to a guy from Canon who told me that, he said, Glenn, really, back then, there was filmmakers, video guys, and there were still photographers. And the still photographers wanted this, video guys wanted this, and they did not think video guys would want to shoot stills and stills guys would want to shoot video. So they thought of them as 2 different product lines and had no interconnection or any real drive to initially put a DSLR out that had total video capabilities. So anyway, that's where your DSLRs stood at the time. So anyway, now remember how we talked about the shot heard around the world when the F900 came out? Well, one of the companies that heard that shot was Dalsa, and you may not be familiar with that, especially the younger film people. You never heard of Dalsa, did you? Well, Dalsa is a company that's located in the suburbs of Toronto, Ontario. They're now owned by Teledyne. And you say, well, what have I heard of, or what have I seen from Dalsa? Well, if you've ever seen a picture from the Mars rover, it's Dalsa's imaging that's in there. They made all the imagers for that. They made 3 of the imaging systems Teledyne did with the new Hub, or whatever they called, the Hub telescope that they just put up in space. I mean, these company makes big time stuff as far as the imaging devices. And they decided that, wait a minute, why should we let Sony have all this fun with the video world when in fact we happen to make a imager, a CCD, that's the same size as a piece of 35mm movie film. So they came up with the idea, well, we'll take that imager and we'll take that PL mount that you guys held, we'll put that in front of it, and that way any motion picture camera lens will work with that imager and it'll derive the exact same depth of field that movie film had. Plus, their imager was 4K, and that was the first time you've ever heard the word 4K in the world of video. Sony wasn't into that, none of these other companies were. So they made this very, I think, unattractive camera here. And they called it the Dalsa Origin, and they got seriously into this. They opened offices in actually very close to where Panavision is out in California, and their idea was that they would rent this camera. They would never sell one of them, they would only rent them, and they were beginning to bring in directors of photography and directors and filmmakers and all kind of people to see this camera. And the camera couldn't record anything inside. They had to have an umbilical cord that went to a separate recorder. And as I said, it was a 4K image, so it had 4 times the data, you know, if you think of a 1080 picture, that you would normally have. And it had the PL mount, so a lot of directors of photography, a lot of people don't know this, but you collect lenses. Like, people collect different things. Well, a lot of the cameramen collect lenses. And any lens the guy had that had a PL mount would work on that camera. So now this was a CCD, frame transfer CCD, and you electronics guys know what that is. It's far superior to a normal CCD, because on a frame transfer you basically have 2 CCDs. You have one that takes the picture and you have another one that's blinded with black. And as soon as you take the picture, your charge coupled devices and the charge buckets or whatever they are move to this bottom section, and then they're read out. And when you do that, you don't have any vertical lines. You could have a headlight right in the shot and you won't get a vertical line, because if you remember the early day CCD cameras if you had them as a home video. If you shot a chandelier, you'd see vertical crap in the picture. Well, there's two ways of solving that, but that's one of the ways, is to have a frame transfer CCD, and it's a much more expensive CCD to make. And but anyway, that was their first camera. Then they got around to helping that make it into something that looked okay. And this was their second generation that they were selling out there, or renting out there for $3,000 a day. And that was called the Dulce Evolution. And it was a pretty nice camera. I was reading that it was used in the movie, James Bond movie, Quantum of Solace. They used a number of these cameras, and because when they digitally edited it, they wanted to have multiple shots on these effect scenes. And so they were getting 4K, effect scenes for the animators and stuff. And it became reasonably popular. The Black Eyed Peas used it for a video. There was 2 movies that were made with that camera. They added the ability of it to record internally back then. And they were doing solid state recording too, which nobody else was really into at that time. And anyway, they made 14 total cameras. And then in 2008, they had realized that Sony had already come out with a full frame or full size imaging, and Aeroflex had already had a Super 35 size imager, and Red had already come out with the Red 1, which had a 4K Super 35 size imager. So they decided to made a situation from the headquarters outside of Toronto that they would just close the place. So they literally closed the whole operation in California. Some of these cameras, I read, went to several different universities for the film department. 2 or 3 of them, went to a museum, and the rest of them went back to their headquarters outside of Toronto. But anyway, that was their experience in the world of making a high-end digital cinema camera. And it also lets you know that it's really hard to compete against Sony. And it's really hard to compete against Aeroflex when you consider the sheer marketing that they're doing. So anyway, that's the Dulce, and that's their current logo. And they closed their place in 2008. So much for Dulce. Goodbye.
Glenn, so if you rented for $3,000 a day then, what would a Panavision Golden or whatever it happened to be cost at that
We used to rent Panaflexes. They were about $1,500 a day, but you had to also rent the lenses. Because Panavision did something really clever. You see that PL lens mount? Well, they had their own mount, and their mount was called the PV mount, and it looked just like that, except it was like 4 millimeters smaller. So, and it was also the flange depth from the lens to the where the images was slightly longer on the Panavision one. So it prevented you from renting their cameras and using your lenses, or the opposite, where you would rent their lenses and put them on your camera. So anyway, 2004, Sony and Panavision, which still had this partnership, announced the Genesis, and that's the Genesis right there. Now, as it turns out, Sony built all the electronics that was inside the Genesis. I mean, literally every bit of it. But Panavision did the whole exterior of the camera and built the entire thing. And as you can see back then, of course they put their proprietary PV mount on it, so only their lenses would work on it. And Panavision, you're thinking, well, wait a minute, this is a film company. Why would they want to be involved in video stuff? Well, they had a little bit of forethought as to what was happening. And number one, they weren't selling film. They're renting stuff. So if you rent this, you still got to rent their lenses and all their other stuff. Plus they priced that actually a little even higher than the normal film because they didn't have very many of these. And they Panavision themselves designed that back. And what they were doing here, and you can see from the industrial design, they were trying to sell the idea of digital cinema cameras to filmmakers. So they wanted a camera that looked like a film camera, which is kind of like, today they don't look like that. And so they put the magazine in the back, what used to be the film mag is now a digital system that's, and back then, remember, it's hard to get memory to run as fast as it runs today. They had a solid state memory system that was in the shape of a basic magazine. They designed that camera where the body of it is almost identical in size to the Panaflex. They put the viewfinder for the cameraman exactly where the Panaflex viewfinder is, and the lens port was exactly, if you laid a Panavision and that movie camera and that side by side, they made sure they had the same vertical height and the same vertical position. That way any accessory that would fit on a Panaflex would fit on this thing. So it was a pretty smart idea, actually. And that camera became very, very popular as a rental camera. It got into the point where there's a bunch of TV series that were shot with that. One of them being, I think, the first 2 seasons of Modern Family were shot with that, and they have a list on there of all the, in Panavision's website, of all the shows and movies that were shot with this. The movie Apocalypto, down, they shot that with these things. But remember, this is only a 1080p camera. So what you guys have now is every bit as good as that. And so anyway, that was what they did back then. Now, and by the way, that's what a Panaflex looks like, and you can see the similarity in the general design of the industrial thing, the way it was put together. And then we go over to Europe and to Germany, and in 2005, ARRI, which I call it ARRI and Aeroflex. The Germans call it ARRI. They pronounce the R differently, but every person I've ever met that's used these, and I used to own 4 of the movie cameras there, we called it ARRI. Anyway, that's their D20. And that camera was kind of unique in a way. They made a D20 and then later a D21. They looked almost identical if you saw the 2 side by side. Now that camera, and I can't walk over there and be in the shot, you see that little thing in the bottom right, there's a green button, that's your start-stop button. And right below it's a little LCD panel that shows you your speed that you're set and how many minutes and seconds you're going on. And to the right of that, you have some other buttons that change what that is. And you notice if you look straight up, you see the viewfinder where it is. Now that's an optical viewfinder and not a CRT, which is pretty unique in a way, and you'll see why. And if you see this little piece here, I'm going to stand over here. Okay, that hump there is that's a rotating mirror system, and it was the shutter that was their standard thing. And Aeroflex cameras always had a shutter that was half mirrored, and so when that shutter was open, light from the lens would hit your imager, and when it was closed, the light would come up and the cameraman would see it. And once again, I think that, well, what they did was they took one of their most popular 35mm movie cameras, which was the 435, an excellent camera, and they copied it. I'm going to show you what that looks like in a second. And they just literally put this, and for the first time, a CMOS imager right where the film plane would be. And they kept most of the mechanism other than the, I'm sure they redid how the race and the different, the gate for it all was done. But the CMOS imager, the same size as what's called Super 35, fit right where the film would have been, and any PL mount lens, you've seen that mount, fit on that camera and worked. And anyway, that's the camera it was modified from, and you can see the same, they even kept the same green start button and the same where the mirror is and everything, and the same place the viewfinder is. So that's how ARRI started into the business. They actually sold some of those D20s and D21s. At first, the D20 ran with an umbilical that came out and went into a Sony DigCams SR deck, their portable deck. So that's how it did. Because remember, it's only a 1080p camera. It's not a 4K camera. Later, they on the D21, they had a way that they could record what was called ARRI RAW, which was their version of a RAW off the sensor onto some kind of device that had a bunch of 4 or 5 hard drives in it. And so anyway, that was how ARRI got into it. And today, that camera has become the Alexa, which is that's probably the most popular camera in Hollywood right now for feature films. And there is now the Alexa LF, which is the large format Alexa, and that's the first Alexa generation right there. But anyway, that's how that camera evolved to where it is today.
How large is the large format?
Large format is 36mm by 24. It's the same as the old time when you shot negatives on the still camera.
Bigger than
Yeah, it's bigger than Super 35. I have a little graphic to show you the different relations of the two. Anyway, 2007, if you guys remember, because all of you guys, a lot of you, I know George was always at NAB, and you remember Red for years was promising this camera that they were putting out, and they were collecting $1,000 deposits from all these filmmakers and everything. Well, 2007 was the year they finally delivered, and they delivered that camera there. It's called the Red One. It had a 4K Super 35 imager on it. It was a CMOS imager, and it sold for $17,000, which was, that sounds like a lot of money. It literally wasn't back then compared to anything else you could buy. And you needed about $3,500 to make it work because they had proprietary memory cards, and you notice no camera, when you see the price, gives you a viewfinder. It would be too much for them to give you a viewfinder. That's a $4,000 or $5,000 option usually. But anyway, that's me down there shooting with one of the very first Reds that ever came into Pittsburgh. I've shot a ton of stuff on Red cameras, but we never owned a Red camera. There's so many of them around, and you can get deals on them to rent, and it's just not worth having it. But that Red camera, everyone that bought one initially became a software expert, because you had to constantly reload the firmware on it, and they would add a little feature or correct a mistake or whatever, and it was not unusual that twice a month you would have firmware upgrades. And I remember that constant thing going on, and people, well, I'm upgrading the firmware. I should have it ready. It should be okay for tomorrow. You know, geez. So anyway, I wanted to show you a commercial that was shot with the very first Red. This is the first one that I know of came into Pittsburgh. I shouldn't say that. I should say the first one I know of where someone bought it and offered it to us to rent. And that was it down there, and it had the standard PL mount lenses on it. And we were doing a commercial for Sharon Regional Hospital, which is up at Sharon, Pennsylvania. It was their orthopedic department. And we shot all around, well, different places, including in the hospital. And let me play that for you. And here's the Red One, the very first Red with Zeiss PL mount lenses.
With every backhand, top shelf, layup, double knot, morning walk, tackle, flight of stairs, double shift, hurdle, shot to the green, or load of laundry. It's good to know the finest spine surgeons, orthopedic specialists, and the region's most comprehensive sports medicine program are right here at Sharon Regional.
So anyway, that was my first experience with the Red One. It makes me laugh because I just noticed the scene there of the girl, high school girl, coming at you doing a hurdle.
Yeah.
And we shot that at the high school up in Sharon that was associated with the hospital. And we set that thing up. It was in August. It was about 75 degrees. And it wasn't even quite 80 degrees. And I'm talking to this girl. We get a 300 millimeter lens on it. And I'm doing some stuff. The camera shuts off. And if you've ever, when you shoot digital and the camera just shuts off like someone unplugs it, you're scared to death that the memory card or some kind of corruption has just happened. And I thought, God, we have 4 or 5 scenes that are already on that memory card. And, you know, so as it turns out, we had to send a production assistant to a 7-Eleven. He bought a bag of ice. We put a plastic tarp over the camera so there was no chance water would leak into it. We put the ice on it. And after, because it had a warning that it was too hot, and after, I forget, it was like 5 minutes or so, not very long, the camera came back alive, and all the memory was okay. So we shot the rest of the day when we were outside with this bag of ice on the camera. And it was kind of funny because that shot there with the girl, I can remember that. My eye was on the viewfinder, but my head was against this bag of ice. And so it's freezing your brain while you're shooting the scene. But anyway, that was the Red One. Since then, I should say, Red has become very, very reliable. They have very reliable cameras that offer a ton of features for the amount of money, and which you'll see later, their latest version of their camera. But and so they're an excellent camera now. But that was the first, and I guess it was just growing pains because it was their very first product that they ever made. And in early 2008, Sony releases this camera, $245,000 for that camera, and the HD Cam SR deck that's stuck on the back. Now, everyone else had been moving to the world of digital memory cards, but Sony kept stick on with tape, and it's because they're one of the largest suppliers of tape in the world. They make 1-inch tape, HD cam, digital beta cam. They make every format of tape in the world. So naturally, they're going to stick a tape deck on there, because then you also have to buy one of their tape decks to use it. And of course, that's an SR tape, so it won't play it in an HD cam normal tape deck. It has to be an SR tape deck. So anyway, that's what they made. And remember, this is only 1080p, and it's still a CCD. So, and of course, it's Super 35, which you'll see the size of the format. And they claim, according to the internet, that they sold 211, I think it said, of those cameras. And at $245,000, I mean, if they actually got that much, they probably, knock the price down for certain people. But of course, they used the PL mount, lens mount on it, so your normal lenses would work. And that was Sony in early 2008. Then in November,
then they were in competition with Panasonic.
Yeah. I forgot to tell you, they had divorced themselves from each other, Panavision and Sony. And Panavision actually got bought up by some investment firm or something, and Sony got their money back out of they owned 8% of it from what I read. Sony did originally. But anyway, in November 2008, Canon introduces the world's game changer, the first DSLR that's designed to be able to shoot 1080p video. And that was called the 5D Mark II. I, of course, ordered one the day they announced it. $2,700 total. You could shoot 24 frame full 1080 video. And the camera had a lot of problems. In the first generation, had tremendous aliasing problems and tremendous moire pattern problems. And by the time they did the 5D Mark III, they got rid of those problems. And that's me down there with the 5D Mark III. And I think I shot, I think I directed and photographed about at least 10 ad campaigns for Eaton Park with that camera. And everyone loved the look at it. It was a very shallow depth of field look. And with the 5D Mark III, it was sharp, but it never had that edgy sharpness that digital stuff frequently has. And so it had a really good look to it. And once again, this was also the last camera that I can think of where the camera was designed to deliver you a pretty much final product video quality-wise. What I'm saying about that is that you would take that video and put it on your timeline, and you maybe touched it up a little bit, but it was pretty damn close to being what you wanted. And from then on, now it's it's the world of logs and different things that are different, which I'll explain in a second here. But anyway, that was the 5D, and I think that was that'll go down as the first DSLR. Now, technically, there was a Nikon D90 that came out a few months before that, but it could only do 720p, and it did it really, really badly. And now everyone said that. It wasn't, the new Nikon is really good, the new one just came out, but that early one. This one here was the one that got the huge amount of sales, and everybody jumped on it. And here's a commercial. I used to do all the ads. Sounds like I'm just some old guy that used to do everything. For West Virginia University hospitals. For 6 years, we did every one of their ad campaigns. And this was shot with the 5D Mark III, and you'll see the real shallow depth of field. And this is just standard, Canon EF series cameras that you would have for your still camera. So here's a 30-second ad here with this.
I would have gone anywhere in the world to save my son. When Aaron was born, he had a heart defect. The doctors told us that his heart was the size of an acorn. You think, how are they going to fix something that's so tiny? We chose WVU Children's Hospital because we trusted them completely. We had some of the best doctors in the country right here at home. What we found was not just amazing medical care, but incredibly warm hearts. WVU Children's Hospital saved my son.
I like that roll focus on the acorn.
Yeah, and I think that camera just had a really good look to it. And but I'm actually wondering why I sold it now. But anyway, that's kind of the end of the history lesson. Since then, cameras, DSLRs have gotten better and better. They're sharper. They have more megapixels and more stuff. And the other cameras, the digital cinema cameras, are pretty good too. And here's for this next section. I wanted to turn on these cameras, and you guys can play with these if you're not used to it. I wanted the younger students, which I don't think are here anymore, to see how heavy this stuff is. And that should come alive in the viewfinder. And here's my favorite, or currently my favorite. It changes all the time. DSLR, which is the Fuji X-T4. And so that's running. If you put your eye to it, the viewfinder will come alive.
Oh, yeah.
And you can adjust the focus and different things on it. So anyway, I wanted to go over these sizes of these imagers because you're seeing this all the time now in ads for things. And full frame is 36 millimeters by 24. And that corresponds to the size of a piece of 35 millimeter negative that you guys used to shoot, if you still did. A lot of you, we don't have any young ones in here now, but the younger ones may have never touched film before. But anyway, that's the full frame, and you can see the CMOS imager that's next to it, and that's the size of the imager. Super 35 is the maximum width you can get between the left sprockets and the right sprockets of a piece of movie film. And technically, it's 24.89 millimeters, but no one cares because they've all adapted the idea that if you have an APS-C imager, you'll call it a Super 35 imager because it just sounds better and it's a more marketable term. And they consider anything from like 23 millimeters to 25 or so to be a Super 35 imager. And my personal preference is Super 35, and it's only because with Super 35, if you're using a normal 35 millimeter lens, you're dealing with the sweet spot, the center 2/3 of it, and you have no vignetting, and you don't have that fall off of sharpness at the edge. And but both of them work, and both of them, both sizes make great looking images. Now, some common quick terms, which all you guys know, but I thought the younger people wouldn't know, and that's log. Everything today seems to be shot in this format called log, which is logarithmic compression. So what the camera's doing is it's debayering the image, first of all, internally. Then it's applying your color correction if you had it set for daylight or for indoor or whatever. And then it's applying your noise reduction setting if you have noise reduction turned on. And then it's taking that entire image, which is far bigger than the 0 to 100% video, because most of the modern day CMOS imagers a lot of them are 16-bit, and there's a whole lot more data in the highlights and the lowlights. And typically the camera's output takes the center area. And instead, with the log, you take the entire top part and squash it down and take the bottom part and lift it up. And it makes, well, you'll see the picture in a minute, it makes a flat image, but it's an image that's designed for you later to take that image and do your color correction and do your, that type of thing. And it gives you the most dynamic range.
What do you mean debayering?
Oh, there's a sense in front of every sensor today. It seems to be they've all adopted the Bayer sensor, which is it's these little green dots. It's green. It's two greens and a red and a blue in front of these pixels. And if you don't debayer it, you get an image that doesn't even look like an image. It's like it's I can't even describe it because it's really not video. But when it goes through that process, a lot of times they're counting on your computer to do the debayering. And in a raw image, for example, Red was the first one to really feature the raw, and they had a thing called Red Code, and they worked really hard on that. And if you remember, they just won a lawsuit against Sony or against Apple that tried to. Apple was putting ProRes at RAW out as a compressed format. Well, Red owns the rights to RAW that's compressed. It's called compressed RAW, and they call theirs Red Code, and they make it the decoder available for free to anybody that wants it. And it works really, really well. You can select 5-to-1 compression, or 8-to-1, or 3-to-1 in the menu system. And but it's a raw 16-bit image later with it that comes out on in your computer. And they give you the software where you can convert that to a normal 1080p thing. So it's it works pretty well. And all the newer editing systems like DaVinci Resolve, you can put the red code directly into it. You can put ARRI RAW directly into it from an ARRI, and it'll automatically, you'll think it's just normal video, but it's on the fly decoding it, so it's pretty complicated. But anyway, log is a compressed video, and people always ask me about this. What does a LUT mean? It stands for lookup table, and it's the mathematical inverse of the log compression. So the thing is compressing the video, but since your clients are on the set with you, they don't want to see any washed out, crappy looking video. So the output of that camera, like the F55 there, on some of the outputs, you can tell it to assign that LUT to it, and the output will become it'll become a normal looking picture that clients can look at and they go, oh wow, this looks great, whatever. Otherwise, they wouldn't say that, believe me, because I'm going to show you in a second here. Now, this here is a Sony S-Log2. This was shot with that camera there, and this is on the air right now for, it's called Veterans Place. And a fellow named Michael Chalik, I don't know if you ever heard of him, but he was the senior cameraman at KDKA and in charge of the other cameramen. Well, he's since retired, and he's a pretty good friend of mine, and his wife is Mary Rob Jackson, and both of them give a whole lot of their time to these veterans causes, and one of them is Veterans Place. So he told me he wanted to shoot the cemetery in the early morning. I said, well, I'll bring all the camera equipment, I'll be your assistant cameraman for the day. So I'll make sure this stuff works. So Michael shot this. This was at Allegheny Cemetery, and this is the early morning light. You can see, the sky and all. That's what's actually being recorded, which is the log signal, and when there's the camera moving, and it just looks washed out. If a client saw that, he'd think you had something all screwed up in your camera or something.
It needs contrast.
Yeah, it needs contrast, it needs everything. But all the details are there. There was details even in the darkest things there. Now, now when it runs through the LUT filter and it runs through color correction, then you get a really cool looking image, and at the same time you can keep all the detail in your highlights, and you can keep dark lights with your adjustments on the when you're doing your I used to call it color correction, but they all call it color grading now, because they have the what is it, the British term that was started over in there. But anyway, that's what that is. And anyway, now we're going to talk about comparing different cameras. I picked a bunch of cameras here, but they all had to be 4K. And 4K is kind of funny because they're actually ultra high definition generally, but I guess all the manufacturers have got together and think they made a deal that you can use either one of those terms, and they don't mean the same thing. One means 4,096 pixels wide, and the UHD, which is ultra high definition, means 3840 wide. But they all say 4K, and if you go into Best Buy, all your TVs will say 4K, when in fact they're not really 4K, they're 3840s, they're ultra high definition. But anyway, and they had to do 24p, because most people, if you're doing any kind of stuff, are going to use 24 frame or other speeds. I mean, 24 is a minimum that they should do. So anyway, nothing is on here that isn't a current model and isn't capable of those two things. And I divided the list up to camcorders, or you could call them digital cinema cameras, mirrorless DSLRs, and specialty camcorders. So the first is the top end 4K digital cinema cameras. And these are the three that I think are the top of the heap right now. The top is the ARRI Alexa LF Mini, and that is a super popular camera in California right now. It sells for $65,000 without a viewfinder or without, they don't even give you the cable to plug it in for $65,000. So that's their primary camera. They make a bigger one that has more detail, it looks like, with LCD screens and stuff, but that one's more popular, and the bigger one, by the way, sells for $102,000, but that's $65,000. The next one down is the Sony Venice, which is an excellent camera, and that camera happens to sell for the same $65,000, so you know who they are competing with. And that camera, well, you'll see some things here that I'm going to talk about. In the bottom right, you're seeing the latest version of Red's camera. That's called I think the V-Raptor, or the V-Raptor. And the V-Raptor is a pretty amazing camera body because it will shoot 8K resolution at 120 frames a second, which is unbelievable, okay? And it'll shoot 4K at 250 frames a second. So, and they get those kind of speeds out of whatever chip they're using. And that camera only sells for $24,500. So, but it's funny, the way the system of Hollywood works, they would rather see the Arri or the new Sony Venice. They don't like seeing red out there for some reason. But, you know, it's used on different movies and everything, but it's just a click, I think, is what I could say.
These all have onboard recording? You're calling them camcorders?
Yes. Yeah, they all can record internally. They have, yeah, I'm going to go over what it takes memory-wise to make one of these work here in a second. This, they all do beautiful imaging as good as you can get. They all have more than 15 f-stops. And remember, film negative has 14 f-stops, theoretically, according to Kodak, from detail in the blackest black to detail in the whitest white. So all these things are exceeding that. As a matter of fact, the red claims it has 17 f-stops of dynamic range. But, and I think the Venice has 16 now, that's what in the latest Venice brochure. And Arri always subrents, they never brag, they'll put 15, even though they know it'll do more. So,
15 plus.
Yeah, 15 plus is exactly what they say. And you have professional industry acceptance on any of these cameras, so you could show up on a set with any movie star or anything, and they would accept that that would be a normal camera there. They won't accept an iPhone, you know, being able to shoot them. And the cons for these things, which this is one thing, this is all related to younger kids that are getting involved in this, and it won't relate probably to you guys. Of course, they're expensive, you know, 25 to 100,000 bucks, that's the kind of range. And for that, you get limited autofocus ability. The Alexa doesn't autofocus at all, because first of all, with the PL mount, it never has the electronic connection to do autofocusing. That connection that you see, it's all those pins in there, if you looked at them, they're to get data from the lens to tell what its f-stop was and what its focus and stuff was, but it can't autofocus. And the Sony Venice can autofocus if you take that mount off and put the E mount on, which they sell for it. So you would use their digital still camera lenses, and then it will autofocus. And the red, believe it or not, that mount that's on there is the new Canon R mount, which is for Canon's mirrorless cameras. And that mount will flawlessly focus on a Canon if you put a Canon lens on there that's made for an R mount. And but in reality, in the world of this cinema, you don't focus yourself. An assistant cameraman focuses. So it's almost, that's why Arri didn't even bother putting that on there or anything. Your assistant. And also, what I put here is, these are really not intended for single person shooting. And they're really not. Look at the Venice, the control panel's on the side opposite of where the cameraman is. So, you know, they assume you're going to have an assistant cameraman. He's going to set up the camera, type in whatever, you know, speed for ISO and different things you want. And the cameraman on the other side will be just framing the shot and doing things. And then that assistant cameraman, if the cameraman screws up, he's out of focus, it's not his fault, it's the assistant cameraman. So, you know, that's the way that works back there. But anyway, the next thing, accessories are sold a la carte for these, and that includes the software-based features. Now, George will understand this from the NEP days, where the software on these high-end cameras, like you bought the, let's just say the Sony Venice, because I know this is pretty detailed. You bought that Sony Venice because you saw in the brochure it has a full frame imager, and you think, oh, this is going to be great, and it can do 120 frames a second. Okay, great for slow motion. So you buy this thing and you go out there and you say, I want to use the full frame. I got this super wide lens for the sunset scene. But you got to put it on, and the menu won't let you address the full frame. So you got to go with your credit card onto Sony's website, and it costs you $440 for 30 days use of your full frame imager. I mean, think about that. You just paid 65,000 bucks for this thing. So that's kind of strange. Then the next shot you're doing is your friend's running across the bridge in slow motion. You want to get, you know, it's like chariots of fire looking all. Well, you can't run it in slow motion without getting on the phone with your credit card, and that's $500 to hit 120 frames per second. So don't be surprised if you rent any of these cameras and the rental place says, well, are you going to shoot in slow motion? That's the reason they're asking, because they're going to have to tack on a fee and stuff. Now, I don't know, and Sony doesn't promote the idea if you can buy a permanent license. They don't. I've looked throughout their website. They have a 12, and they have a 14-day and a 30-day, but they do not have listed a permanent license.
The broadcast cameras did they? But I don't know about the digital cinema, different product division.
You know, it would have to be in the thousands if it's...
Oh, it was crazy. You know, if you
Yeah.
had a camera that you bought that just did 1080p and you wanted to turn 4K on.
Oh, you couldn't even turn it on. So.
Yeah, write a check.
And so, anyway, but this seems to be an accepted practice in that industry today. And, you know, and the people that are surprised are always told, oh, don't you know, you got to buy them. And you feel like a fool because you just paid that money and you don't realize what you're doing.
So if it wasn't full frame, it was Super 35?
It was Super 35, is the way that camera normally turns on.
Yeah.
And so, you know, it's just a strange world to do that. But anyway, they have heavy and expensive gold mount batteries, which are, you know, gold mount is an Anton Bauer mount, and the V mounts are the standard ones that sort of a lot of people make that snap in vertically. And those batteries are typically $200-300 for a battery, and they weigh 2 or 3 pounds. So it isn't like you're buying some little lightweight battery. And of course, the memory cards for these things. Now, I keep picking on the Sony Venice because I'm pretty familiar with it. The Sony Venice uses the same memory cards that this camera uses right here. And they're inside this little, let me turn it off right now. There's one of them in there, but if you were to use a normal camera, you're used to this. This is the highest quality SanDisk SD card that they make, 300 megabytes per second card to do this. They charge $90 at B&H. This is a current price for that card, and it's 64 gigabytes. So anyway, if you buy the card, the 64 gig for this, it's $600. And that's a lot of difference. Now, I own 6 of the cards for this one. So that's $3,600 worth of memory cards just to, you know, to take on a shoot.
Is there a difference between those two?
This is supposed to be a little bit faster. If you look at it, it says it'll do a recording of 400.
Oh, 400.
Yeah, megabytes per second, and this will only do 300 megabytes per second. So
That'll make up for all that tape we're not selling.
yeah, and it's funny too because with the Aries, you got to buy a Sony SXX card. So Sony owns the right to that format of that card, and they're supposed to be really robust. I've never had a problem with them with this, but I hope I never do. But and also one thing too, if you guys ever buy stuff on eBay, never buy used memory cards. Because no one ever sells a memory card that they like.
Yeah.
You only sell them if all of a sudden something happened and now you reformatted it. Now you suddenly in your mind don't trust that card. And that's why you see used memory cards on there typically.
Glenn, what's the record time on that?
On 60, well this one's recording at, I think it's 360 megabits or something per second in 4K. So it does just about 30 minutes on 64 gigs. A lot of people have the 128s, but Christ, they're twice as much. They're $1,200 a piece, and you know some crew guy's going to drop that or something.
You're used to a 30-minute film load anyway.
Yeah, 11 minutes.
You have to say 30.
Yeah, 35,000 foot 35 is 11 minutes. But anyway, these are the medium price 4K Pro, and I think this range here represents the most value for your money. And what you're getting versus what you're paying for. These are $3,500 to $15,000, which is that's a pretty high thing for someone to pay for, but it's not like the last ones. They all have a great slow motion ability. They all have excellent low light capability. The Blackmagic design went up there. They sell that in 2 different models. One's 12K, believe it or not, in Super 35, and they also sell 4K or 4.6K or something. And they both sell for the same price, believe it or not. I think it's $3,900 or right around $4,000 for that camera. Of course, you got to buy the viewfinder, which is $1,000, but still, it's not that bad compared to the previous ones. That's the new red Komodo, or I think it's called Komodo.
Yeah, I think it is.
Yeah, and that camera has become pretty popular because it's $6,600. And it can do a whole bunch of speeds and functions, and you know, I haven't read anything bad about it. It's very lightweight. As a matter of fact, that was heavily used in this new movie called Ambulance that's coming out from, what's the name, the crazy photographer that did the Transformers. Who?
Michael Bay.
Yeah, Michael Bay. And they mounted those things on helicopters, those little baby helicopters. That's how light that is. And we're able to shoot some amazingly bizarre shots with those things.
Doesn't even look like a camera.
No, it looks like a little box with a lens. Once again, it has the RF lens mount for the Canon lens mount. And one thing nice about the mirrorless idea, you have a very little flange distance like that. The standard flange distance on an RF mount is 20 millimeters from the front edge that your lens would hit to where the sensor's imaging is. And that's so short that you can put adapters, which are nothing more than mechanical things, to make almost any lens you ever heard of work on any of these cameras, actually. The next one down is the world standard. It's always called the documentary camera, which is the Canon C300, and that's the Mark III C300, and it's a Super 35-1.2, and it's about the 10,000 range for its price. And the final one is the Sony FX9, and that's a $10,000 camera. It's an excellent camera. It's got a full-size, full-frame imager, and it has all kinds of different functions like variable neutral density filler in there and all kind of stuff that's in that camera. And anyway, the cons here, of course, the lenses are sold separately, and people don't realize that when they get involved in one of these, because once you get that larger sensor, you're no longer going to get a 12-to-1 zoom or a 15-to-1 zoom like you're used to with video. You're now going to be sort of locked into the zoom lenses they sell for still cameras, and those are typically 3-to-1, 2-to-1. You would buy a 16-to-35, a 24-to-70, 70-to-200, and that would be the general range. And most people would buy those three lenses, and they would buy maybe a set of 5 primes that were f1.4s, so they could shoot in a darker area without losing the light that the zoom would have. Now they do make, I saw a Canon zoom for Super 35 that's a 10-to-1 zoom, but it's $29,500. What was the most expensive lens you ever bought, George, for NEP?
Probably at the time hundreds, 101, which were over $100,000.
Yeah, so I mean, you'll spend far more on the lens than you will on the camera.
Yeah.
That seems
the camera's the accessory.
Yeah, the accessory for the lens. And then we go to the cheap ones. Okay, these are the inexpensive 4K camcorders. And these are the three that I picked out. The 1,000 to 3,500 maximum range. They're super lightweight. They're mostly plastic, so you could walk around all day with it and not even know you had it in your hand. They have an auto everything button where you can switch them to do, if you hand it to your friend and say grab a shot of something, you can hit that button and it'll do everything itself. They all have a built-in zoom lens. The one I'm most familiar with is the top one there, the Sony. And the reason is I live very close to the Byzantine Catholic Seminary. As a matter of fact, my wife is the registrar there. And at that seminary, the main guy asked me, he said, Glenn, pick out a camera for us that we can buy that we can use for, they have a YouTube channel. And they wanted something that anyone that's there could pick it up and shoot, say, some priest getting ordained or something without any knowledge of anything. So I would always turn to Sony for something like that, just mentally. Anyway, I got them that camera, which is, I'm going to show you about 20 seconds of video from it, which is pretty surprisingly good for what it is. And that camera was $1,069, I think. And the other thing is, of course, they record on those inexpensive SD cards, and they have lightweight, inexpensive batteries. They're like 65-buck batteries. You can put 2 of them in your pocket and shoot all day. And the cons, now, the small sensors. I was going to bring one of the sensors for one of these things. When you see a 1/4-inch sensor, it makes that 2/3 inch one look big. And when you're down to a 1/4-inch sensor, a bunch of things happen. Number one, you have an infinite depth of field, everything's sharp. And number one. And number two, you always will lose with the small sensor dynamic range and low light capability, no matter how you look around, especially on a 4K sensor. And anyway, here's and there's noticeable video compression in low price cameras. because if you, especially on a noisy scene, you'll see it later that it's being compressed and stuff with blocks. And here's that little cheap Sony FDR AX53. This is original video from it with it just switched in the automatic mode and me just pointing it. That's all I did. I didn't have to focus it, didn't do anything. This is in my house. And once again, you'll see how the whites are clipped off with the all the highlights. You just lose any detail in them. But you know, here's what it looks like. And you know, for a YouTube channel or something, who's going to know? That's my granddaughter, little Charlotte. And you know, here's a camera that's costing hardly anything, and you know, you see the clipping on the white dog, and of course the sky, which was a neatly detailed sky, is all white now. But that's the example of the lower dynamic range. But you got to give something up for only $1,000. So I thought, yeah, I thought in general it you know, it looked pretty. It looked well worth the money that they spent for it, and I was glad of that, because they, you know, I had to drive it over to them and not apologize for it. Now the mirrorless DSLRs. This is an area that I like these cameras a lot. At the top is the Canon R5. That's the C model, which was the cinema model R5. That's the one that doesn't burn up when it runs. They re-released the R5 and made the cinema version of R5 and added a fan inside it. And so they get more money for it, but it's a really, I've seen pictures from it. It's an 8K camera. It'll shoot 8K video, and with the fan, it'll run all day, sitting there running with 8K.
Or a bag of ice.
Yeah, you don't need any bag of ice for that one. The next one down is the Sony A7S III, which has become real popular in video. It has huge pixels on that CMOS sensor because it's only a 10 megapixel sensor, and all you need for 4K is, I think, 8.2 megapixels. So that it does a really nice image for that. And then that's the brand new Nikon Z9, I think it's called, or no, N9. It's either N9 or Z9. That just came out and just starting to get delivered. But they had it's been really hyped by everybody, and they've all shown the sort of amazing autofocus stuff on it. And the Fuji, that's my camera there, the X-T4. And Fuji's about to introduce a new camera at the end of this month. On the 30th, they have a show, and they're going to introduce a new video-centric camera. And so, of course, that one will end up getting sold. And the bottom is the Micro Four Thirds GH6. That's the latest of those. And I wouldn't recommend anyone get involved with the Micro Four Thirds unless you're already into that system, because you'll end up with stuff that's unique to Micro Four Thirds and not applicable to anything else. And especially if you buy lenses for the cameras. Now, what I mentioned here, of course, it has great dual use for still photography and video. Now, I love still photography. It's hard to make a living or doing stuff with still photography today because people just buy stock photos. For most of the ads you see are stock photos that you see. But I use the still photography because what we do is we go out to a location, and I'll take the same camera and the same lenses, and we'll pre-plan exactly what we're going to shoot when we have the real crew and everybody there. That way you realize, oh, I can't shoot at this angle because there's a big UPNC side, but if I shoot this way, it looks great. And so you literally save yourself time on the shoot, and that's what I use the camera for in addition to video. Small, lightweight batteries, good slow motion, excellent low light, and excellent autofocus capability. Now, one thing you got to learn about that autofocus capability, and younger people that are just starting always want that freaking autofocus on video. That autofocus only works well when you have a lens that's made by the company that made the camera. I've never seen it work well where if you put a, say, an adapted Canon lens on that Sony camera, you can make it focus and you can make it do things. But when you hit the autofocus, it isn't fast enough. It has to, I think they're translating the data from the Canon to Sony or something with the adapters. And it's on video. On still photos, it seems to work okay, but on video where they're doing constant things, it doesn't seem to work. I've never seen it work right for things like that. And so if you insist on autofocus, you're going to end up having to buy lenses from the same company. And the cons for these, there's very little frame rate selection, and most people don't realize that. But even on the most expensive one there, which I think is either the Nikon or the Canon there, you have 24 frames. When I say 24, it's actually 23.98, but 24, 30, 60, and 120. And those are your steps. So when we used to do a lot of work for like G. Hyman and the beer commercials. You want to shoot beer at 96 frames per second. It looks great at 96. Looks appetizing, the bubbles look right. If you shoot at 120, it looks more like molasses. If you shoot slower than that, it looks too watery. And you notice that speed wouldn't be one that you could select here. So it's just something to think about. In normal life, if you're shooting 24 frames, who cares? But if you're doing that. And also the same is true with the shutter angle. Now I was shooting an ad, matter of fact it's on the air now for Excella Healthcare, and we had two doctors and they were looking at an LCD screen and it was playing back an MRI, an MRI recorded image of a heart valve problem. And we framed it up as just an excuse to see these two doctors on TV. And but all of a sudden you notice the LCD screen was pulsing, like just enough of a pulse to irritate you. And so if it had been the DSLR, you would have just lived with it. With that Sony camera, you just dial the shutter speed down 1 degree at a time till all of a sudden that disappears. So that's a function that the bigger cinema cameras or whatever have that the DSLRs don't have.
Glenn, are those all full frame? They didn't look.
No.
Okay.
The Canon is full, the Nikon's full, and the Sony is full. The Fuji is Super 35.
Does it matter a lot?
No.
Okay.
No.
But
yeah.
Question about DSLRs. I shoot both, and there's a 30-minute limit, at least the ones in the U.S. for recording video, right? So the audience might be interested in it.
Yeah, there was something that dealt with tax or something.
A tariff, yes.
Yeah. I don't. I've never shot anything that was 30 minutes, so.
I mean, I still be shooting it now on that, but that'd be changing the every 30. So
I don't know. You're right. There could be that on some of those. Who knows? I don't know. I never checked that. But anyway, here's I call them specialty cameras. These are great for those 1 or 2 cutaways in your spot that are your project that needs this weird angle or something crazy that you don't expect. And of course, everyone's familiar with the Gopro. And then the next one down is a favorite camera of mine. I have a couple of them actually. It's DJI's Pocket 2 cinema camera. And that's a 4K camera that makes excellent looking 4K video. There's no Mori pattern, there's no aliasing, there's no nothing in it. It's perfect. And I've taken that before in operating rooms and we've taped it onto a metal rod and held it at the top of the whole operating field. And it has the ability where you can watch it on an iPhone so you can see what you're getting. And you can actually start and stop it on the iPhone. And it records internally. But, you can get DJI is kind of like the king of the drone business. Yeah. Their little gimbal stabilizer on the top is amazing. No matter what you do, it's smooth. And so anyway, that's a neat little camera that I have. Of course, everyone's familiar with the iPhone with the 3 cameras, and it can make some amazing pictures too. And the other reason for one of these cameras is that you can get into a situation where you don't really want anyone to know you're filming, and that's a real good use for the iPhone because people are so used to everyone taking iPhone pictures they don't even look at it anymore. But if you set up that camera on a crab dolly or something on the street, the police are going to expect you to have a filming permit. If it's on a sidewalk, you have to have a cop with you to make sure no one trips or you have the wires. I mean, there's all kind of expense, but if you needed just that shot of the girl running out of the car and heading up the steps, you could shoot it with one of these things and no one would be the wiser for it in the movie or in the thing. And so anyway, that's it. And a few final thoughts. There's no one best camera for all shooting situations. I think that's one thing you learn in life is that there's certain cameras, it's like a carpenter coming in. He might have a huge hammer for cement work, but a little fine one for woodwork. And so, it's important, especially for younger people, to know the pros and cons of different cameras and what you can do, what you can't do, because you never want to be in a position where you're at the mercy of the equipment. I mean, that is just a horrible feeling, and or not knowing when you go to the shoot whether or not that lens is actually going to work in that darker light and that kind of situation. Also, your first pro camera should probably be a mirrorless DSLR. And I underlined the word mirrorless because if you buy something used, I don't think mirrored DSLRs are made anymore, but all the mirrorless ones are great because you get that OLED high resolution viewfinder up here, plus you get the LCD screen on the back. And with a mirrored DSLR, as soon as you hit it to the video mode, the mirror flips up out of the way and your top viewfinder becomes useless because it's blocked off from light. So anyway, the mirrorless DSLR is the way to go. And today there are adapters for less than $20 where mechanically you can put almost any lens you ever heard of on a mirrorless DSLR. And that's a pretty good thing. I collect Canon EF series lenses, and I use them on everything. Matter of fact, this thing here, this F55 actually has a Canon mount in there, if you noticed it. So, I mean, you can modify you can use the Canon EF lenses on pretty much anything. And always remember, having the latest and most expensive camera gear doesn't necessarily make you a better filmmaker. It just makes you, maybe you're a little bit poorer filmmaker, financially poor. Anyway, that's it. Thanks. One other thing. Since chances are, and I was hoping there would be more students here, that they will never work with actual movie film. I brought 1 foot strips of 35mm negative from a job that we did years ago, and I thought that would be a neat little souvenir to have because they'll probably never touch movie film and the way that the world's going. So anyway, thanks guys.
Thank you, Glenn. That was great. You know, it's not often we get someone who has actually used every kind of camera. And so it goes to show you how many years you've been in the business too.
Yeah.
So, but that was great. I really appreciate it. Thank you all for coming here. Again, the next meeting is going to be about a review of the NAB, new technology, new thinking, new trends, things like that. It'll be sometime in June. And we haven't set a date or location yet. It may actually be a Zoom meeting as we are still considering hybrid in-person and Zoom. And again, Tim, thank you very much for getting us here and making this venue available. It's really great. I really appreciate it.
Glenn, I have a question.
Yeah.
Referring to your first point about no one camera is good for everything.
Yeah.
You just do 30-second spots, so I'm not sure this would be the case.
Yeah.
Have you ever mixed footage?
Oh yeah, all the time. All the time. Matter of fact, what I typically do when we're doing these, I shouldn't just talk about hospital spots, but hospitals are, for some reason, we get a lot of work for the advertising in hospitals. We'll use this one on a crab dolly for planned shots. And then I'll use this one to run around and get the B-roll cutaways. And now with that log format, you can color correct these things with, I use DaVinci Resolve, and with that you can color correct any of these cameras as long as they're not making a picture that's like out of focus or something, you know, wrong about it. But these match up pretty well. The Sony S-Log 2 and the Fuji, it's called F-Log for the Fuji. Nikon's are N-Log. I mean, they all do kind of the same thing, and so that's real common. And if you were doing a movie, you would be more critical of it if you were intercutting scenes. But in our case, suddenly you're going to a whole different room, and maybe there's a baby in a bassinet or something, and a nurse picks him up. It's so different than the operating room shots. You know, even the same camera wouldn't look the same because of the differences. But anyway, this camera here is actually quite amazing. The other thing I should tell you guys is if you want cameras, you should buy them used. I mean, this is a bit of advice for you. This camera here, when Sony sold it, I didn't pay this for it, but this camera sold for $41,000. And for $41,000, they got an extra $6,000 for this OLED viewfinder. And they got, of course, it didn't have batteries or anything. And I was able to buy this quite a while ago off of eBay for like $6,800, and it's in pristine condition. And eBay always sides with the buyer, by the way. So the best thing you can hope for is if you're looking, and Tweeter knows this because he and I both sell stuff. If you put something like, it's perfect condition or works perfectly, or any kind of statement like that, you as the buyer have the ability to say, wait a minute, it's not perfect at all. And you can decide later that you don't like it, and they are forced to give you your money back. And they never, right, Tweet? Yeah. I mean, he and I have both. I can tell you an example. I sold a woman in California. I used to have a Olympus lens. It was a really good quality zoom. It was a 12 to whatever their 3:1 lens was. It was an f2 lens too as a zoom, but it didn't have autofocus ability. That model just doesn't have. Well, the girl claims that, and you shouldn't put this on camera, but you, as the buyer on eBay, you have far more rights than the seller does, believe me. And they look at it that way. I think it's because Amazon, you take anything back. Well, they sort of keep that in their head at eBay. But they have every lens that you see, like the 24 to 70 standard Canon, lens, which is a real popular, the f2.8 24 to 70. You'll always find them at half price on eBay. You can find them, 5 of them at half price, and so in other words, let someone else take the depreciation on that initial cost, and if you're buying it for the school or buying it for something, then they'll expect to buy new stuff, not used stuff.
And shameless self-promotion, look for the semi-annual Bexell used equipment sales.
Oh.
Typically it's stuff that comes off reality shows.
Yeah.
They need 20 cameras for Survivor, the series gets canceled. 10 cents on the dollar. It's amazing.
Wow. And you guys, you don't buy from that day, or do you?
Well, NEP owns Bexell.
Oh, when will they have that sale?
They just wrapped one up, but if you go to Bexell, it's friends and family.
Oh, B-E-X-C-E-L.
B-E-X-E-L.
Yeah, oh, okay.
Or if you Google Dale Stores, the woman who runs it.
That would be a great way for colleges to get a lot of high-end equipment too.
Well, it's all kinds of stuff, whether you want LED light panels or all wireless cameras, lenses. Always a lot of cameras and lenses of all flavors. Because productions will buy them and then they don't want them anymore, they get rid of them.
I can't believe that camera ran all that. They ran that long with that battery. So. But anyway, well, thanks for everyone paying attention, and thanks for Robert Morris again for letting us be here.
So if folks want to stick around or want to see something on your way out, I'm happy. Some folks asked if they could see